Hello, everyone. Today is Thursday, November 19th. As always, I'm your host for Collectibles and Coffee, Edward Nguyen. My beverage of choice today is orange juice, mixing it up. I probably should change the name away from coffee because I really just don't drink coffee anymore. Today, we have an interview. We have Michael Caffrey with us. If you've been following this channel before, you may have heard him on. He is the owner of Two-Way Magic and Tales of Adventure in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So today, he'll be kind of talking with us about comics. This is one of the things that I've been meaning to do an episode on. Unfortunately, I just don't know enough about comics to really get into it. So he's here. He's an expert on this. Today we'll just be going over that, just kind of the basics, a lot of probably preliminary information that I'll share that I know, and then we'll really let him get in. He has some visuals as well. So Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself for the people who may be new and haven't joined us before.
Yep. So currently I'm drinking ginger ale. I've been mostly caffeine free for about 2 months now, except when I'm traveling and driving a bunch. But then it kind of helps. I own TOAmagic.com. I've been dealing in magic and comics for almost a decade at this point. So I have a pretty good grasp of the market overall, the history of the industry, and where I'd be putting money if I was planning on spending money in the industry.
Okay, excellent. So just to preface, this is my understanding of comics, so I was kind of give a brief rundown. I imagine that this probably isn't too different from most people. This is probably a very general understanding. If you don't deal heavily in comics, this is just probably things you hear about the grapevine. So basically, the extent to which I understand comics is the golden age. Probably we're looking at, was it like late 1938, 1939 or something, up until the mid 50s. Silver era is basically that until I think the early 70s, and then and obviously I would identify like what the big ones are, right? Like the first printings of Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, etc. Those are obviously the big money ones. But if you just showed me a random comic from the 80s, I couldn't tell you if it was worth $100 or like $1,000 or something. And that's I assume most people would probably be in that era unless they did follow heavily on comics. So film there, I guess. Like, what else kind of a general understanding should most people know?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent start. Um, Basically, the way that comics are chronologed, or the way that they're grouped based on the era that they're from. Uh, the big defining things about the different eras are the art style, the storytelling style, uh, and in some cases the size of the books, because Golden Age books were both more pages initially and wider. They shrunk a little bit in the 60s with the Silver Age. Um, but I don't think there's too much of a reason to delve into all the history. The big one to pay attention to is that the transformational period of comics, where there's a lot of nostalgia and a lot of collectability, is in the 1960s. That's the Silver Age. I started in 1961 with Fantastic Four #1 for Marvel. For DC, it kind of starts in 1956 with Showcase 4, which is the first Silver Age Flash, as well as Brave and the Bold 28, which is the first Justice League, which was a little bit later. But realistically, the concept of a superhero comic is where we're going to spend most of our conversation. I can show off some of the things here that are around that, but not super relevant in the whole conversation. Um, Hopefully this shows up well. I have to figure out the angles. It's going to be bad no matter what.
You probably want to tilt it like forward just so the glare. Yep, that's good.
That's good.
Yep.
So this is Brave and the Bold 28. It's the first appearance of the Justice League. This is the first time we saw a real team-up book of popular heroes. So we have Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Flash, Aquaman, and Superman. And I think I got everyone. But anyway, team-up books. So this is the kind of the collectible sense of nostalgia that most people are going to have, because especially in the current market, superheroes are very relatable. The movies have done a number to the industry. And if you go forward 20 or 40 years, everybody's going to know who superheroes are. On the other side, when you get back into the Golden Age, which is 1939 through the late 50s, you have a lot of diversity in types of books. But as a collectibles market, it becomes a little bit less accessible to a lot of people. This is one of my favorite older books. So this is Crime Suspense Stories 22. Comics in the late 50s really pushed the bounds of the medium in terms of what they were allowed to do, what they're allowed to get away with. Covers like this prompted the Comics Code, where the government kind of stepped in and said, hey, you're corrupting the youth, because this is back in the McCarthy era, Red Scare, et cetera. Everything you're doing is really bad. You need to do something about this. So the industry decided to self-censor itself and restrict some of the things that it was doing, where you couldn't glorify crime, you couldn't have a decapitation on the cover and whatnot. So material like this is popular, but a lot of what defines comics from the 30s, 40s, and 50s is a particular artist or art style. I don't have any great examples of an art style from this era, but in general, you go forward 40 years and people aren't going to know who Joe Manili is anymore, who are some of these good artists who contributed to the form. Obviously, someone like Frank Frazetta is going to stay around for a while. But if we're talking about things that are collectible and have volume, really, we really kind of have to stick to the 60s forward, and that's kind of where most of this conversation is going to go.
Okay, that's some good preliminary knowledge. And that's obviously like far more than what I know, and I think that's like kind of a good jumping board just for people to really get in. So I guess just even on a more basic level, what do we like? How do we identify comics? Like, what makes a comic book a comic book?
So in general, comics are the pairing of words and images in a sequential fashion. So these date to the late 1800s with the introduction of Yellow Kid, which is kind of the first example of that. And there's been some historians going back and trying to look at this stuff. One of the key things to remember, though, is every comic book printed up until we can basically say the 1980s was designed to be disposable media. It was printed on very, very cheap paper. It's newsprint with 2 staples in it. It's going to get thrown out like a regular newspaper or anything else. If you go back 300 or 400 years, you find plenty of examples of bound books and Bibles and volumes and whatnot, because they were designed to be kept and people generally treated them with care. Action Comics #1, which is the first appearance of Superman, had a print run of 1 million issues, but there are fewer than 100 believed to still exist. Pre-war books in particular have some scarcity at hand, because the paper drives during the Second World War saw a bunch of them getting recycled and pulped up for the war effort. But realistically, very, very few copies of any of this material has survived in any form to this day. And that kind of is what drives the collectible demand in this key 1960s, 1970s era, even though so much was produced.
That's crazy to think that a print run of 1 million has basically attrition down to 100. But I guess it makes sense. I think the idea that, like you mentioned, a lot of the older comics, even up until very recently, comics just weren't made with good paper. So trying to keep something like that in that medium for, we're talking almost 80 years now, is just going to be something that is just going to be very difficult.
So there's been a couple what are known as pedigree collections, which are the collection of an individual that they bought off the newsstand over a period of several months or several years. There's 2 in particular that I want to talk about in terms of Action 1 and preservation. The first one was found fairly recently, past 10 years, and I think it was the highest graded Action Comics #1, but it was found in cedar chests kept in the mountains of West Virginia. So West Virginia, the climate's very cool, pretty dry, and cedar is good for preserving things. So it just sat at the bottom of this chest for 80 years untouched and ended up just staying very, very nice. One of the other pedigrees, it was out west in California, where it was a very well-off family, and the kid was drafted into the war effort, and his parents kept buying him comics every week while he was away at the war. Well, he died in action, so all of these books were stacked up in his room for like 50 years and never read. So the preservation was, again, immaculate because they were just untouched and unmoved.
That's pretty phenomenal. Like, I think those are like these are probably like the 2 top graded comics, right?
There's a couple other ones where that's the case. The Edgar Church pedigree, Mile High Comics, was founded based on it. Was a adult illustrator who bought comics to look at the cover, and he would do his own drawings because he did work for other magazines, but he wanted the reference material, so he bought one of basically everything, and again kept it very, very nice. But we're talking maybe 50 to 75 of these collections total throughout history that have ever been found.
That's pretty phenomenal to hear about. It's definitely like a good historical piece to kind of do more research into. So shifting away from that, while we're still on topic of history, how have comics really changed over the years? Where 80 years is a pretty big time span for the industry to really change and evolve.
Yeah. So in the beginning with comics, in the 1930s, so comics had the cover price of 10 cents. They were frequently more pages. They're about 52 pages, give or take. There's a bunch of different publishers who all did their own things. These books generally featured a variety of stories. So you'll typically have 5 or 6 page stories of different characters. Action 1, first appearance of Superman. Superman's on the cover, but it was only in 6 or 8 pages of the actual book because the rest of it is stories about other characters. So you have a kind of pretty broad breadth of these superhero, or of stories being told in these comics, even though it is a superhero comic. At the time, comics were 10 cents. So I've talked to some older people who were alive in that era, and they talked about they'd go recycle 2 glass bottles and get a nickel a piece for recycling the glass, and they'd go and spend their nickel, spend 2 nickels on a comic book, or they can spend 1 nickel and get a comic with the cover off, and it was way cheaper. Superheroes were fairly popular throughout the 40s because of the war. You got a lot of great covers of Captain America comics. Number 1 is Captain America punching Hitler, where the books during the war were kind of a reflection on society at the time. Moving past the 40s, again, you see comics reflecting on society. So the Red Scare, as well as space exploration, becomes a pretty popular topic. There's a lot of different comics about space, about unknown, about aliens, and those kind of take to the forefront a little bit. Some comics have atom bomb covers over fears with Russia. When the U.S. military deployed to Korea, you saw comics that interacted with Korea as a subject matter, as opposed to war comics in the 40s that took place in World War II. So comics generally age with the era. The 60s saw resurgence of superhero comics, but that era is largely defined by superheroes and not as much by societal issues. When you get into the 70s, you see some really cool social commentary issues. You see X-Men as an entire subject matter, which really came to its own with X-Men 94, was the start of new content on the X-Men, which I have here. This is the new team that we're all kind of familiar with. Starting out in the book, this is when Chris Claremont started writing for the X-Men. And that's the team that we're kind of familiar with. But throughout the entirety of the 70s, X-Men confronted a lot of social issues. So you see things like the mutant registry and the concept of racism in society. The movie Days of Future Past was based on comics X-Men 140 and 141 and 142. That really delves down on the concept of othering people. Amazing Spider-Man issues 96 through 98 dealt with the drug problem that was facing America in the mid 70s. Green Lantern 85 has a story called My Ward is a Junkie. Green Lantern's partner Speedy was addicted to cocaine, and it deals with the fallout of that. In the 1980s, we see technology kind of catch up with what's going on with comics in general. Historically, comics were fairly expensive to produce. The print runs were pretty large. 100,000, 300,000 was fairly common for a lot of books. But the mimeograph machine let comics be reproduced very cheaply. It meant that people can do things at home. So this is where we saw Turtles #1 get printed. Turtles #1 had a print run of like 1,500 copies in the first print, because somebody decided they wanted to draw it, did it in their home, ran it off, and they submitted ads to the comic fan magazines at the time and just sold their own books that way because that's what they wanted to do. Bone number one's fairly the same way. Throughout the 1980s, a lot of this material kind of flooded the market and was the first kind of boom bust cycle that we saw with comics. In the late 70s as well was the first real comic book store, dedicated store. For the most part, comics were all sold in drugstores or in chain stores on spinner racks or on newsstands. Having dedicated comic book stores changed the way that the hobby was viewed by some people because there were people that were dedicated to this hobby now. Uh, Getting into the early 1990s, we saw the first big news headline, which was Action Comics sold for a record $82,500. So you saw a lot of newspaper articles about that, which meant that in general, people were going out and buying comics with the intention of, oh, I'm going to get rich off this. I'm going to retire off this. And we'll talk about my investment advice later on. But in the 90s in general, there's a lot of people who just bought a bunch of new number ones, expecting them to do well. X-Men number one sold 8.1 million copies, which is still a record for the most copies ever produced of a comic. Spawn 1, the independent book, sold 1.7 million copies. So again, very, very large print runs, larger than anything we've ever seen. And all of these copies stayed in very nice shape. A couple years ago, I bought a collection from another store that had about 2,000 copies of X-Men number one and 300 copies of Spawn 1 still in the sealed case. Keep in mind that collection was bought 35 years after those books came out, which meant that after a fairly significant amount of time, so many copies were still kept in very nice condition, which really hurts the potential value of a book like that, of those types of books. And for investment purposes, it's not really where I'd want to invest money. In 1995, we saw some changes with distribution. Marvel Comics decided to buy a distributor and distribute exclusively through Heroes World. This was pretty disastrous in the industry because comics couldn't get out to fans. So Marvel, which was publicly traded at the time, went through bankruptcy. This is why we saw a lot of very strange film rights for who has the ability to make certain movies or certain characters. We saw Guardians of the Galaxy being the first big Marvel team movie because those rights were never sold off, whereas the X-Men rights were sold off to Sony, the Spider-Man rights were sold off, and all of these different components of rights were sold off at various points in time to different people because Marvel was publicly traded and just trying to secure money for themselves to pocket. Going forward past the 90s into the early 2000s, we see collectability of everything tend to shrink. We saw print runs go way down in size. So if we look to something like Batman right now has a print run of about 100,000 copies total for any given week, which is way less than what it was 10 or 20 years ago. We'll frequently see new books with a print run under 20,000, 30,000 copies for a lot of items. So when we see a new hero like Silk emerge or Spider-Gwen in Edge of Spider-Verse 2, there might only be 40 or 50,000 copies total printed of that book, and most of them went in the hands of collectors because they're not printing more of the stuff than there's actual demand for, which means that print runs are just very low, and these books have inherent scarcity and some amount of demand out of the gate for anything new.
So I guess you kind of wrapped up there with the the 2000s. What does we've obviously seen a pretty big evolution there. I think just that historical lesson was pretty phenomenal. I didn't realize that there was that much nuance over the generations. Looking at it now, what do you think? Obviously, kind of, I feel like the movies, the fact that the past decade and a half or so, we've really seen a surge in superhero movies. They've really been brought back to the forefront of some of these big companies that are really trying to push them back. What do you think these movies have really done to the comic book industry?
So it's a little unfortunate that we haven't seen quite the coattails in new comic book readership that you would expect. But I think a lot of that's also just based on how expensive comics are. Comics are $3.99 to $5.99 each now, which is a lot of money for people to read in general, for a younger person to read. You can't really buy that much at a time compared to, you buy Netflix for $8 a month or what have you, and can watch everything. So as a physical media, it's, I don't want to say it's a dying media for new comics, but in a lot of ways it is. The typical subscriber that comes to our store is between 35 and 55 who's been reading for 20 years. Not a lot of people in their teens or 20s, which is a little unfortunate in the grand scheme for the future of the industry overall. A lot of the dealers that are buying and selling comics right now are up there in age. A couple of them, their kids have started to run the company. So the industry overall is kind of old, I guess. But as a media, I don't think you're ever really going to see comics die off entirely. The movies have been phenomenal for older books. They really have driven the value. We have a couple customers who are trying to collect the first appearance of every character that appears in their favorite movies, which is oftentimes a number of different books, especially if it's something like X-Men where they come from all different eras. So there's definitely demand. There's definitely continued interest in the media form, but seeing that long term is a little strange.
So if we look at this from an investment perspective, it seems like there's two things at play here. It seems like you mentioned, the fact that there is kind of a resurgence with the movies, people trying to go back, and your collectors trying to collect the first appearance of every character, for example. But you also mentioned that it is dying in one form, in the sense that a lot of the customer base who are going on buying these are generally older versus a millennial. For someone who grew up in the year 2000, they may have seen these movies when they were in their teens or something, like, if they were born 2000, 12 years old when like some of the first Avengers movies were coming out, but they're not really getting into the comic book industry. So from an investment perspective, how do you kind of balance and kind of reconcile these two seemingly diverging opinions?
So my biggest advice for buying comics from a investment perspective is first, you have to look at these types of items on a 5 or 10 year trajectory. Trying to invest in a 6 month sort of window just isn't really feasible. The transactional cost of buying and selling comics is oftentimes much higher than it is for a comparable trading card. If you look at you have a BGS 9.5 Unlimited Black Lotus. A 9.5 is a 9.5, and if you took every 9.5 ever printed, you might have one that's 19,000. The other might be 22,000 for the very ends of a 9.5. But if you look at a recent comic book, even one that's been professionally graded, and we'll get to grading in a second, you might have a copy that sold for 4,000. You might have a copy that sold for 5,500, because the nuance of how comics present and how they get collected is so different. For instance, so this is Adventure 247. This is the first appearance of the Legion of Superheroes, but you'll notice the numerical grade is a 0.5. Well, a 0.5 can mean a lot of different things. In this case, it's missing page 7, which makes it an incomplete comic. So it's going to be described as incomplete. But the cover is fairly all together. It looks nice. It would set up really nicely on a shelf somewhere for somebody. Somebody is likely going to pay more for that book, even though it's missing a page, than they would for a 0.5 that has the top third of the cover removed, because it has a different amount of eye appeal. So there's a lot of nuance in anytime you're looking at an individual book, because it's not quite a widget. It's not quite a stock market item. Now, in terms of transactional costs, a lot of these big books change hands at auction houses, and you're going to see a 20% buyer's premium, plus possibly some fees for yourself, depending on how big the books are. And even if you try to sell something like this yourself, and you find a buyer, you're probably going to be taking a 20% hit selling it to a store like anything else. But you also have to factor in that you're going to be paying $15 or $20 to mail this item, and you're also going to have to be paying insurance on it because they're kind of easy to damage, really. So there's a little bit of finickiness with the subject overall, in that you want to be careful with what you're buying to ensure that you're actually getting good returns. Uh, I think that investing in comics is generally fine. I'll pick a couple of books that I think are reasonable to invest in later as a subject matter. And in general, you see really strong year-over-year returns. The problem is, again, you suffer from a bigger lack of liquidity for comics than you would for a comparable high-grade Magic card, where there's probably buyers at a small margin on basically everything. So if you mess up, you can get out of it pretty quickly. But that's kind of my take as an investment category.
So we'll kind of bounce back to investment in a moment here, but looking behind you, you've held up a bunch of comics. So explain the grading process. So because you obviously have a pretty big mix there. Like, how does a comic book get graded? What is the criteria that they look for? Because with Magic cards or any trading card, it's pretty straightforward. We have edges, corners, surface, and
Centering.
and centering. Right? Those are pretty straightforward. How do we define a better condition comic book versus a worse one, and how does that translate into a grade?
So if you want to learn how to grade comics well, the Overstreet Guide to Grading Comics is the single best book you can buy. I should have one on the shelf behind me. It's in the other room, but it features pictures of books from 9.8, which is the top condition, all the way down to a 0.3, which is the lowest condition. And it also features the same book in 8.0, 6.0, 4.0, 2.0, so you can get a really good grasp of how defects affect the grade and quality of a book. There's two companies that grade comics: CGC, based in Florida, which also grades trading cards now, and CVCS, which is owned by Beckett, which is in Texas. CGC has a very strong brand advantage to the point where their books return a pretty large margin over a comparable CVCS book. So in terms of investing, I would only invest in CGC books, and if I bought something CVCS, I would get it cross-graded into CGC because the liquidity overall in that market is much higher. Now, we talked about this being a 0.5, and I'm not sure how well the camera is going to show any of this off. Now, the big thing is this is a 0.5 because it's incomplete, but also if you look down here along the spine, you see it's literally not attached to the staple. There's pieces missing here. Those sorts of things all count against you pretty harshly. The rest of the book looks pretty nice. There's some surface scuffing over here you can see, as well as down here you have color missing from the book. So all of these things kind of count against it. If you only had like this half of the book and the spine was reasonably nice, you're probably looking at like a 2.0 or a 3.0 out of 10 because of the color just missing from the cover. Going on the real high end here, this is the X-Men 94. This is graded a 9.4. So this is a very nice book. And you can kind of see at the top corner up here, there's a small amount of creasing. So that's the biggest defect on this book. Just refamiliarizing myself with it. But that defect is basically the difference between being a 9.8 and a 9.4. The rest of it generally is very sharp. The corner is very clean and crisp, and there's no real visible marks on the front. Obviously, you have to grade the back of the book as well, but the back is about as boring as it can be. Realistically, though, in general, comics are based on an accumulation of defects, and the more different things wrong with an individual book, the lower the grade's going to be. It's a little bit of an art, a little bit of a science in a lot of ways, because comics are so much bigger than individual cards. So you have to weigh the combination of defects, and that some combinations are going to be judged more harshly than others. If you had just that one patch of that scuffing on an otherwise brand new book, is that a 6.0, is that a 5.0? There's some guides and some resources that will figure that out for you. But in general, there's a little bit of how is CGC going to grade this on a particular day, because there's just so much more material to look at.
So on kind of in the topic of graded comics as well, restoration. I know that's something that is fairly unpopular in some industries. For example, if right, obviously Magic, if you're touching up a card with Sharpies, that's a big no no. That's inking. In coins, same idea. People, p the coin version of CGC, they
And NGC, I think.
NGC. There's also PGCS, Professional Coin, PCGS. That's another one. Grading coins, where the part of taking a brush and scraping off debris on the coin and trying to get more shine to it, that's a big no no as well. But in comics, restoration is a thing. So if you want to touch on that briefly.
So the first part of restoration is what's not restoration. And there's a very broad subject of pressing and cleaning and improving a comic book. This is primarily done to flatten out bends or light creasing, and will improve the visual eye appeal of the book, as well as the numerical grade of the book, but is not considered restoration. You're not adding anything to the book. You're not taking anything away. Therefore, it's theoretically undetectable and allowed, permitted, and actually encouraged. CGC has a separate division of the company that will press and improve your comics for you. Just if you picture a piece of paper that like you crumble into a ball and it's kind of wrinkly, you can smooth a lot of that out, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. So if you are buying raw comics to get submitted, definitely look into pressing and see if your books would improve by that. Not all books will. And in fact, some of these we know were not pressed when they're originally graded, but we determined that a press wouldn't improve the grade of the book. If you look back at the X-Men 94 here, all right, we took a look at this top corner. That defect by itself is going to make it so we're not going to get above a 9.4. I'm sorry, 9.2 on this book. That caps it at a 9.2. So even if you took the time to open it, press it, and try and improve it, you're not going to get it to a 9.4, which means it's not worth doing. Cleaning is also similarly undetectable. This is removing dirt from the surface of the book. Generally, you're going to use a soft pencil eraser or absorbing putty in a small ball to just pull off some of the surface dirt. And you're not adding anything to the comic itself. You're not really taking away anything away structurally from it. So it's not really detectable. That said, comic restoration goes very deep. One of the ways to look at comic restoration is kind of like art restoration. When you look at art from the 1400s or 1500s, in that some of these books are so old or in such bad shape because of storage that they're literally deteriorating as time goes on. So some amount of conservation work is needed to be done to keep them together. There's two metal staples in the spine of a book that are holding everything together. Well, those accumulate rust if they're stored in a moist area. And if you start getting rust in there that is migrating to the rest of the book, you're not really going to be able to stop that. So physically removing the staples or replacing them is actually the best option for the book, but is still considered restoration. But it's better than not having a book at all. Restoration also includes color touch, which is literally painting over portions of the cover to improve eye appeal. That sort of restoration is really frowned upon. And in general, graded books that are restored are falling under a purple label and are generally worth significantly less. There's more degrees of restoration. The worst one for comic collectors is trimming, which is literally taking a individual book, and I don't have anything restored right now. I sold a restored book recently that I was intending to feature. But taking a knife and slicing the top or the side or the bottom off, because if you'll see on a book like this, right, the top edge shows more wear than everything else. So if that top edge was suddenly a little bit lower, well, you remove a bunch of the wear and you make the book a lot nicer. Now, when you're talking for a trimmed comic for value, you're looking like 10% of the value of a untrimmed copy of the same book in the same grade. keep in mind it's not like a linear comparison. If you have a book that might be a 2.5 raw, but if you cut the damage part off, it becomes a 4.5. Like, yeah, clearly, the 4.5 trimmed is not going to be worth more than the 2.5 would, because you could just do that and increase the value. This is a big reason why CGC exists. This is a big reason that if you are planning on investing in comics, I would only stick to graded books, because restoration on older books is such a big value swing. So the book I just sold was a Amazing Fantasy 15 in 6.5 that was restored. I traded it away at $25,000, but if that book was Blue Label unrestored, it might be $75,000 at this point. So there's just a very big value difference in restored and unrestored material.
So I guess that would kind of shift to my next question. In the context of customers for comic books, what type of customers do you generally have, and what is their real reason for spending big money on comics, right? Because like some of it, I assume graded is largely eye appeal. People want something that they can have in a showcase for display, similar to what you have behind you, for example. Who is really your customer for comic books, just kind of on different budgets, right? You mentioned one for $25,000, but you can find comics for $4, for example. There's a pretty big spread there. And obviously you have experience having done this for 10 years now or so.
So there's a very wide breadth of people who are buying comics in a retail environment. We have about 100 boxes that we put out for sale for $1 a piece. And we do a couple $1,000s a month at books for $1 a piece. So at the low end, a lot of it's just cheap, affordable entertainment, because a lot of this is still entertainment. A lot of customers are trying to put together runs of comics where they're trying to get every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, for instance, where there's 700 Amazing Spider-Man issues, and where there's 700 different Amazing Spider-Man issues. So we can collect all 700. Now, obviously, they started at 700, where you're buying a lot of these issues for $1 or $2 or $3. And then you get back to the 1970s and everything's suddenly $10, and you get back to the 60s and it's $50 or $100. And then, the first 20 or 30 become very, very daunting. So they might end up trying to pick up 1 or 2 of these every month when they get, a fifth paycheck in a month or something. And so it really goes all over the place for how people are actively buying stuff. On the high end, there are buyers who only buy key issues or special issues that are the first appearance of somebody or the death of somebody or a major story point. So there's a lot of interest in that type of material as well, which is why the keys are worth so much more than the surrounding issues. But there's really a comic book for everybody.
So what do you think some of the pros versus cons in investing are? Some of these we touched on. The fact that I think you mentioned that there really is a comic book for everyone has appeal. But going forward, someone who is looking to start maybe getting into market now, given where we are in the world, it just feels like buying assets in general are pretty good. We've touched on some of the downsides, some of the upsides. What is your real personal take on this? Like, what would you suggest to someone if they were looking to start out and they said, "Hey, I have $5,000 I want to get in," and just squirrel this away? What's the approach here?
So step 1, only buy graded comics. Step 2, understand what you're buying and understand the underlying nature of what these things are. So comic books aren't just widgets, right? This isn't a stock. It isn't like a sneaker where it just exists. These have underlying market forces where a character that becomes more popular or less popular, or changing social issues, may bring a book to the forefront that otherwise was largely forgotten about. An example of this is House of Secrets 92 is the first Swamp Thing. That book's exploded a lot in the past 2 years. On the budget side, something like Amazing Spider-Man 212 is the first Hydro Man that is scheduled to be in an upcoming movie at some point. So that saw a lot of growth. So a lot of the opportunity is kind of confined in those types of areas. But really buy what you enjoy, because this is still art. You can hang this up, you can put it on the wall. for almost every comic. Most of the covers are fairly reasonable. But my biggest advice is don't buy into a bubble or don't buy into hype. Venom is very popular right now with Amazing Spider-Man 300. 98 copies are almost $5,000 by themselves. So I wouldn't try and buy that because that was a $1,500 book a year ago. But what I would look at is things that were kind of popular 2 or 3 years ago that haven't really moved a lot or have had less gains than other books. Strange Tales 110, which is the first Doctor Strange, might be one of my bigger picks. That book is just a very tough book to find. Doctor Strange is scheduled to still be in the upcoming movie, so they're still relevant. Marvel Spotlight 5, first Ghost Rider, same thing, right? We haven't had a Ghost Rider movie in a while because they've all been really bad. Nicolas Cage, not a good actor. I know you came here for my movie takes, but a book like that, if there ends up being a Ghost Rider movie again, has significant room for growth. And in the meantime, it's still a book that it's still a character that matters, right? They're still making new Ghost Rider material. So if you enjoy Ghost Rider, maybe go that route. If you have a higher budget overall, I would shoot for a Silver Age #1. So that's basically Amazing Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Avengers, or somewhat Daredevil. All the Daredevil's a little bit worse. Or one of the mega keys from the 60s. So Tales of Suspense 39, first Iron Man. Journey into Mystery 83, first Thor. Those types of books are the most likely to have very stable returns because there's enough on the market that you see these popping up for sale every week or every month. Right, I'm sure we'll see 40 copies of each of these sold across the year this year, which means there's a market. It means that your items have value and that you're able to track that value over time very easily. But at the same time, they're scarce enough that somebody deciding to dump their hoard of this book isn't going to happen, isn't going to crater the market. If you go back to a book from the 40s, I like Robin as a character. So Detective Comics 38 is the first Robin. That book gets sold once or twice a year. From an investment perspective, those might actually be the best investments because there's so much scarcity and they'll respond to buyer demand much faster, but there's not an efficient market. And I don't like buying when you can't have a market. If you have a 4.0 copy and the only sale in the past year is a 1.5, what is your 4.0 supposed to be worth? And that kind of becomes a challenge for a seller when you have to sell the stuff, or even when you have to insure it, that you have to play a lot of guessing games for this material. But realistically, my investment advice is don't buy into hype, stick to graded, stick to superheroes, and you should have pretty good returns overall. Oh, and stick to relevant. Every time that you have a comic, you should be able to explain to somebody who walks into your house or explain to your mother why this book matters. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't buy the book. What that means is that everything should have some underlying coolness to it. So for instance, in Superman number 5, Lex Luthor gets his red hair. And that's like the most relevant part of this book. It's like second Lex Luthor. I wouldn't buy that book because there's no cultural significance to it. It's just, sure, it's cool. There's a story attached, but to the average person, it's not relevant. Whereas if you say, oh yeah, have you seen Doctor Strange, the movie? Well, here's this character's first appearance. You get immediate attachment, and those types of items theoretically will overperform everything else because they're well known.
So I guess last two questions on the investment topic itself. Where does one go to buy higher end graded comic books? Is eBay just kind of your go-to? I know Heritage Auction, some of the much higher end comic books, they are realized at some of these premier auction houses. But just for people who obviously don't have tens of thousands, hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars to spend, where are you going out and getting some of these mid-tier comics?
So if you wanted to go ahead and buy comics and you had a budget in mind, you're fairly committed to doing this. The first $100 I would spend is on a website called gpanalysis.com. This is historical comic book sales over the past 20 years all over the internet. So this is your primary way to research. And you get to see basically every recorded sale of an individual graded comic for that time frame. This is going to give you a perspective on what you should be paying, on trends, on and just your overall approach to what you're doing. Second, I would develop a list of items that you want in your portfolio that you're going to be bidding on and trying to buy when you hit the right item. I posted an ad on Facebook saying, hey, I'm looking to buy graded books. I want to pay 70% of GPA on anything over $1,000. And somebody had sold me a Brave and the Bold 28 that had a piece missing out of the quarter. So it was less visually appealing than some of the other ones, but I got it at my price. And if I was investing, it would have fit my portfolio very well. If you're looking for major sites, eBay, of course, is one. MyComicShop.com is Lone Star Comics based out of Texas. You have Heritage Auctions every month. You have Comic Connect every week or every month. You have Metropolis, which is based in New York City. There's dozens of big players, and then when shows inevitably resume, you can buy a lot of these books in person as well. Just be warned, a lot of times you're going to be paying a premium in person because of the nature of comic transactions. People like knowing what they have. So dealers in person are generally going to be able to charge a little bit more than they might otherwise. But in general, there's auctions going on all the time. If you're sticking to items that have a significant number of transactions overall of buying and selling, you should have a good feel for what these books are worth. And if you're happy with what your buy-in price is, and just target kind of where you can get a good deal is really what it comes down to. Don't feel like you absolutely must buy this one particular book at whatever price it is, because you're going to lose a lot of points on the buy-in.
And then my last question is, from my perspective, someone who doesn't know very much, what concern is there for someone who is getting in about counterfeits, about scams that are in the comic book industry? Because again, from the way I see it, a comic book is nothing more than a printed piece of paper. How hard can it really be to do counterfeit a comic book? And I assume this is something that's done, especially when you have comic books that could potentially sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So there's counterfeit comic books basically don't exist. And this has to do with, well, the way they're made, really. If you go back into the 60s, it's all newsprint, and now you're trying to print comics on 50 or 60-year-old paper and then make them look appropriately aged and have that work out. And it doesn't really, you can't really do that effectively. Plus the printing equipment for this stuff is, they made 500,000 of these at a time for a lot of these books. So most of these items were made on very expensive at the time printers that no longer exist. So as best I can tell, there hasn't been a real case of counterfeiting on a vintage book of any sort. There's one really well-known example of counterfeit material, and that's Cerebus #1. Cerebus is a independent book written and drawn by Dave Sim, who's a Canadian, in that 80s era, same as Turtles and Bone 1. It's all black and white, so very low quality. It's mimeographed, and it's fairly easy to do counterfeits of because the quality is so bad. And that book does have known counterfeits. That said, that's partly why I say stick to grading. Restoration is a much bigger concern than straight up counterfeits. On a graded book, these are all sealed by sound at CGC, so you can actually see. They've changed the case a couple times, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find the particular type of case. I don't have the case that I want. But you can actually see here, poorly probably, but the side actually splits open a little bit, and that's actually normal. But what you want to make sure of is that you have the four corners intact. These are actual posts. They're about this big, with the post about here. And as long as you have all four corners intact, you're basically fine. And that's, again, the advantage to buying to buying graded comics is that you're fairly sure and protected in what you're getting, and it gets as close to a transactional item as you realistically can.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's this is all definitely very informative. This is again someone who coming from someone I imagine there's a lot of people like myself who just don't deal heavily in comics. It definitely seems very daunting, especially because comic books I think are one of those things that I probably have passed on the opportunity to make money on them because you do see a fair amount of them. They are something that do occur at yard sales, estate sales, people just selling off comic books in mass. I assume most of them there probably is a bulk price for comic books. I know that you buy because I've been to your store. You have just these bins, like large bins. I've seen them inside your warehouse as well. Just countless bins of just comic books that are presumably relatively worthless.
Yeah. So rough guide to buying comics that you find somewhere. If it has a cover, meaning it looks reasonably cohesive, you can pay 10 cents a piece and be fine. That means for a long box, like a 3-foot long box, you're paying like $30. And that's a very conservative number, but that's kind of I'm not going to lose at this number. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to find books that cheap. So you kind of have to know what you're looking for in terms of key issues. But beyond that, look at cover price. Books in the 10 cent, 12 cent, 15 cent range are generally going to be better books across the board. And you can probably pay like $1 each on anything in that range and probably do okay. And obviously, you could pay $1.12 book and it's worth $3,000, or it could be worth $4. But there's a lot of flex to it and a lot of know-how. In general, if you think you're coming across something that's interesting, and you're not pressed for time, take some photos and send them to me, and I'd be more than happy to say, oh yeah, this is good, this is not good. Obviously, I'd hope you sell it to me afterwards. But if you have a box where you're like, oh, this is all 10 cent, 12 cent old material that's really desirable, then it's definitely more interesting of is there one good book in here? Because really that's what a lot of comics comes down to. Is there something in here that I can actually make a lot of money on? In the typical long box, you might find one or two $20 plus books with a lot of it just being kind of unsellable material. And that's kind of the reality of buying comics in the wild. So like you can get lucky, but it's unlikely you're going to get that lucky.
Fair enough. I think for an overall episode, I think there's definitely a lot to absorb there. I think I think this does help me get, I would hope some listeners as well, kind of a good idea of where to get started on all this, at least if comic books come by, like what resources to use and how to approach them. So that'll more or less wrap up today's episode. I do have one final question that's on the outline, and this is something I ask every guest. If I gave you personally $100,000 and I said this is for investment purposes, you don't get to see any return on what you buy for 5 years, so you can't just pay off debt or something, what would you do with $100,000?
Let's see. 5 years is kind of an interesting term, because there's a lot going on with where the world is in 5 years. I think we've seen such record growth in Pokemon and sports cards recently that I wouldn't necessarily want to be too deep in any of that type of material. I feel like a reasonably diverse portfolio would start with like a Legends booster box, because you don't have to worry about liquidity because it's just investment, right? And you don't really have to worry about storage in the same sense because it's kind of all just lumped in. I'd probably spend $15,000 on a Legends box.
I don't know if you can get Legends booster box for $15,000 anymore. I think they've gone more expensive since all this.
How high are they now? The 20?
I want to say they're closer to 30 because I know that I think there was some I think I saw in the sealed collectors group some people were asking about them. So
Uh,
yeah, basically all like just sealed product for
all
Magic.
vintage sealed, yeah.
Yeah, like even the dark boxes are in demand. There's been an explosion of demand for that. People just decided it's too cheap.
I
So
I sold a Mirage Visions Weatherlight set for like $3,000 back in March or April, and that's like a $5,000 3-box set now. So it makes sense. Well, there goes that plan. Um, but because I did like those in the 5-year plan because of where everything else is. Um, in terms of uh, buying as an index, um, God, I have a cheese answer, and it's not really, it's not scalable. It's not usable for everybody else. Um, but for the best outcome over 5 years, uh, is discount graphic novels from distribution if you own a comic book store. So periodically, Marvel will do big sales where they'll sell things for 85, 90, 95% off. So I own 500 copies of Deadpool Volume 1 graphic novel that I paid $2 each for, that have a sticker price of $40. So as long as it recovers, like, it's a very, very safe investment. But again, you're talking several pallets of material. Although the returns for that sort of thing are great. In a investment sense, I mean, I want to say comics in general, because I think the stability on that window, especially if you can't sell it early, are inherently going to be much higher. Where like you just have lower volatility investing in comics than you would in Magic cards. I think I would go for I don't know if this is possible, but I'm going to go check to see if it is. I really like buying restored comic books for a 5-year plan. This is not investment advice for a pretty obvious reason, but I really like restored because the market is likely going to catch up to restored being less of a bad thing in the future, is kind of my guess. What you're seeing is that you have younger and younger people who want to be in on this stuff, but can't afford the $100,000 price tag on something. And if you're going to hang it up on the wall anyway, well, you might as well just get something that looks really nice. Yeah, I think we're priced out of that. So something that kind of where I'd be targeting is like 4.0 to 5.0 graded restored comics that are Silver Age keys or bigger. So I'd only be willing to buy books that I'd be spending $5,000 or more on. I was looking to see if you can get an Action 1 restored for $100,000, but that's probably about $250,000 in any grade restored if one comes up. But like you can get a Batman 1 restored for like $35,000 or $40,000. That looks very nice. So I think the eye appeal combination there is something that we're going to be seeing some changing reactions to in the future. But I think we're a little bit ahead, so you're kind of buying into that pretty well.
fair enough. I think that is. So you'd probably be looking at like a dozen or so $5,000 to $10,000 comics. That seems to be kind of what you're leaning towards. Fair enough. Since you brought it up, how does one store a pallet of comic books, or just, I guess, like just a sizable quantity of comic books in general?
Generally poorly. I know a number of people who are selling off their comics because of lack of space, which is again why, for investment purposes, graded books are denser. They're much easier to store. For us, we have a warehouse where we have a pallet jack, and we can wrap a pallet and keep it kind of climate controlled. For the average person, they kind of just have a row of long boxes in their dining room or what have you, whatever comic room they're allowed to have. So there's some innovative displays, but there's not really a great way to store a large volume of comic books in any sense of the word.
Yeah, I assume that was kind of the case, because having seen your store and having seen the boxes in both the warehouse and the store. That was kind of what I was curious, but that makes sense. I think comic books do kind of fall in that realm of they're just a little bit too bulky for relative to what they're worth. When you can consider, people have EDH decks that are $25,000 or something, right? Versus getting a unit of comic book scared to be worth that much. Like how much would an entire run of the like Amazing Spider-Man be? Like for your collector who's trying to get one of every comic for that. Like how much would that be in value? And I guess like 700 comics would probably be
like 2 or 3 boxes. Yeah.
Yeah. So probably like nine long feet of space.
Yeah. Stacked end to end, it's like 9 feet. I would guess that a run of Spider-Man's maybe 30,000 now, somewhere around there. Because depending on condition, obviously, you're looking at $1,000 a book for most of the first 10 issues, or more. And then once you hit issue 100, everything kind of gets pretty cheap.
And how many are there total? You said like 700 something?
700 was the number 6 years ago, and now there's probably another 150.
Okay, fair enough. So that'll probably be more or less a wrap on today's episode. Michael, thank you for being with us always and enlightening us, especially because this is a topic that I really had no idea. I've been wanting to do this, but I just don't know enough about comics. I think that applies to a fair amount of things as well. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Edwin13. You can find the social media sites for Rumor on the right. Michael, where can people find you if they choose to interact with you or buy from you?
You can find me on Twitter at TOA Michael. You can email me, toacomics@gmail.com, or stop into our retail store in Coopersburg, Pennsylvania.
All right. That'll be a wrap on today. As always, thank you all for listening. Wherever you're in the world, stay safe, and we'll be back tomorrow with more. Thanks again. All right. We are off.